Thanks for coming back in so quickly. We are going to now hear from Kimberly Barr. She is a licensed genetic counselor at Kaiser Permanente Medical Center in San Francisco, and she's been practicing for 25 years and has worked with a wide variety of individuals and families impacted by genetic conditions. I think it's really an important time for us to hear from Kim about this aspect. We all have a million questions, and especially as parents, working with our kids, our teenagers, our young adult family members who are beginning their own families. There's a lot to understand. I know that I struggled when I was first married to understand and explain it. We went to a geneticist. I got the basics. I still needed a cheat sheet of the diagram to explain it. My husband does it much better than I do. So now, Kim, please come forward.
Thank you. Do I have a mic that I can actually walk around? Can I use that one over there?
This one here is live.
The one over here. I think it's on. We're on. Is that one? Okay. This one live?
Yes, it is.
Okay. You guys can hear me? No? Is there an on?
Is there an on? Yeah, they're both turned on. Tommy?
Oh, I hear.
They're both on.
Can you guys hear? Oh, hello, there we are. Okay.
That one should be working as well.
This one in here? No. I don't want that one, because I'm coming up here. So I'm a genetic counselor, and what I want to find out is how many of you have actually met with a genetic counselor at some point about this condition? Okay, less than half of this group. Amazing. Not so amazing to me because, to be full disclosure, I don't know that I've actually had someone referred to me with this condition. What that means is you guys are getting counseled about the genetics by someone completely outside of my field most of the time. So what are we going to cover today? We're going to talk about the genetic cause of XLH. Let's get this right. So we're going to talk about some of the things you've already heard, but I'm going to go into one different aspect, the genetic pieces and how that influences you guys. We're going to review the inheritance in a way that you'll walk out of here and be able to say it backwards and forwards without going back to that diagram each time. And finally, we're going to explore the reproductive risks. What does this mean for your kids? What does this mean if you have kids? This is the first question you probably asked when you heard this diagnosis. Now, if it was in your family, someone explained it to you somewhere along the way. You want to have a basic, simple explanation for people. So this is a genetic bone disorder that is due to low blood phosphate, a mineral in my blood. Real simple. But it's part of a bigger picture. It's part of a group of conditions called hereditary hypophosphatemic rickets. Big mouthful. Do you need to say that? You probably don't need to say that to everyone you meet. But recognize that XLH is one of a group of conditions. It's not the only one out there. A little bit about the phosphorus. You heard this earlier. I'm going to repeat it in some simple terms. Phosphate's in all foods. And in fact, in our Western diet, we typically get all the phosphate our body usually needs. We probably get more than that, and some of it gets peed out. About 1% of your body weight is phosphate. 85%, almost all of that, is actually stored in your bones. It's not floating around in your blood. Only about 1% is actually floating around in your blood. So that low level is accounting for that 1%, except things get drawn off the bones. So you've heard the bottom line is this process of how phosphorus works in your body is really complicated. It starts with vitamin D. You get it from your diet, you get it from the sun, your skin makes the vitamin D. Your intestines suck in the calcium and phosphorus and the vitamin D that you're eating, and your liver makes that vitamin D active. So that's all the top part up there. And then it really gets complicated. The calcium gets into your bloodstream, it gets put into your bones. What you don't need gets sent out through your kidneys. But this cycle has a lot of steps to it. Trying to figure out all of those steps is really, really challenging. And this simple talk isn't going to talk about it. That's not my area of expertise. What I want you to know is you don't have to know all of these steps to really understand what's going on here. The clinical diagnosis is really how X-linked hypophosphatemia, I will never say this correctly. See, I can't even pronounce it. XLH gets diagnosed most of the time. You have a clinical diagnosis. The lower limbs start bowing as soon as you get weight bearing and you are actually stressing those soft bones. Someone does an x-ray and say, gosh, there's not as much minerals here as we expect. Ultimately, you have some blood and urine testing that shows, well, you have enough vitamin D and your calcium levels are normal, but your kidneys aren't recycling that phosphate. The blood levels of phosphate are far lower than they should be. That's the diagnosis. That's all you need to say you have this condition. The medical issues I am not going to cover. Those have already been covered pretty well, and you guys know them better than I do. But recognize that all of these things could happen if you have this condition. You've heard this in every talk now, I think, but I'm going to remind you again, because in genetics, I deal with rare conditions. So when the families come into me, the first thing I hear is, I've never heard of this before. How common is this? Where did this come from? Well, this is about 1 in 20,000 people. So in the United States, that's 16,000 individuals who have this condition. You've heard this in every talk as well. You are not alone. It's a really helpful, valuable thing to remember is you're not the only one out there dealing with this. You're not the first person in the world to have this. There will be more people after this who have this condition. So what causes it? Some of the things that come up, this isn't a dietary issue. It's not because you're not eating the right things. This isn't bad parenting. You're not doing things to your kids that cause any of this to happen. This isn't anything your parents did or didn't do, or you did or didn't do during your pregnancy. So before I say none of these things you should be doing, that's not what I'm condoning here. It's caused by a change in a single gene. Now think about that for a minute. We have about 20,000 genes that provide the genetic instructions for our bodies to work. Every single cell in your body contains that full set of those instructions. One of those genes is not working in this condition. And that causes all of those symptoms that you have. You heard the name of it. I loved your explanation. That's really helpful, the FEX gene. So it was discovered 20 years ago. And this makes an enzyme that looks like it's supposed to break down some other proteins. But it's made in the bones and the teeth. It's not made in the kidneys or the GI tract where things get absorbed. So what does it do? Again, you've heard this a little bit already. We know that it's similar to other proteins that break down proteins. So it's an enzyme that's supposed to break down, we think, other proteins. But we really don't know what it does. When you look and try and figure out what exactly is it supposed to be breaking down that it's not breaking down, we have no clue. Now you've heard this FGF23 is increased. So is it supposed to break down that? Well, there's at least one study that says it doesn't do it directly. So it's doing something that isn't breaking down something else that's telling your body, make more of this FGF23. But the bottom line is we really don't understand the underlying, the real key to what's happening with this FEX gene. I'm not going to talk too much about this because it was covered earlier, but just some simple repeats. FGF23 is a hormone made by a completely different gene. This is not the gene that's not working in XLH. But it causes the kidneys to release the phosphate, and it stops the body from making active vitamin D, so you don't have the ability to do the things that we need vitamin D to do. And it's made in the bone cells, but it actually moves then to the kidneys to do its work. Another question that comes up a lot when I'm talking with somebody is, where did this come from? So this is another place I want to show of hands. I heard earlier that you work mostly with people who have family histories of this. So how many people in here have 2 or more individuals in their family with XLH? Okay, not quite half the room. How many people have a single family member with XLH? It's about a 50-50 split. Very interesting. So the familial, This is what about half of you are dealing with. We know that there's more than one person in this family with XLH, and we know that that was inherited from one of the parents. Now, it can be inherited from either your mom or dad, so it doesn't matter which side of the family it came from, you can inherit it. But I heard a lot of questions about this possibility. Sporadic. What's sporadic? Sporadic means this is the first time in the family that this has happened. When we go back and look at the parents, neither parent has a change in the FEX gene. Well, how does that happen? It happens as what's called a de novo mutation. That's a fancy term to say this is a brand new genetic change that happened in either the egg or the sperm. And this happens quite frequently in genetics. We see this quite often in conditions, especially dominant conditions, where all it takes is one change for the gene to stop working the way it should. What's interesting in this condition is women or females or girls are more likely to be that sporadic mutation. Their X chromosome, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, is more likely to have a change in the FEX gene. The question comes up, well, why is that? One of the things we know is that in the father, sperm is produced continually throughout his lifetime, and so copying that sperm over and over and over again, random changes take place. We see these de novo mutations happening as fathers age. So someone was asking earlier, could there be a higher rate of these sporadic mutations? There might be if we're having older fathers having kids. Can it ever come from a change in the mother's egg? Absolutely. So these kind of random changes can happen in either the egg or the sperm. There's a little bit of evidence to say it happens more often in the sperm, but there's nothing we can do about it. These are random changes that we can't change. The bottom line, genetic changes have to start somewhere. And that's the question I always get is, well, why now? No good answer to that. Philosophically, you want to go that direction? We can talk philosophically. But from a genetic standpoint, there's no good reason why, except we know genetic changes happen. So how do you make a genetic diagnosis of XLH? This is different than that clinical diagnosis. For a genetic diagnosis, we actually have to look at the gene, which is located on the X chromosome. We are looking for what's called a pathogenic variant. That is the medical term that's just recently been, you'll hear me talk about a mutation. All that is referring to is a genetic change that makes the gene not work. So a pathogenic variant means the gene might be a change in the DNA code. So our DNA code, if you remember, I don't know if any of you saw Gattaca, one of my favorite movies, but it's a 4-letter code. There's only 4 letters in our DNA, repeated in all sorts of variations that our body reads like an instruction. So in that DNA code, somewhere in the gene, there might be a change in the sequence where that letter or several letters aren't the way they're supposed to be. There can also be a segment of the gene that might be missing entirely. It just didn't get copied over when it was supposed to. Or maybe it got copied 2 times or 3 times, and so you've got a duplication. Any of those things are possible, have been reported, and can affect the way the gene works. The reports out there say there have been over 285 different genetic variations that affect the way the FEX gene works. So let me put that into perspective for you. Every single one of those 285 changes was a sporadic change somewhere along the way. So we know that this happens randomly. We know there's lots of different changes that can affect the way the gene works. And that takes us to the next question. So, okay, once we know it's not working, how does it run in families? You've heard this term several times today, X-linked dominant. Okay, what does that really, really mean? I won't be genetics if I don't show you some chromosomes. That's my job, I think. There's an obligation that you have to see chromosomes somewhere along the way. So remember those genetic instructions that I talked about, 20,000 instructions? They're actually contained in the chromosome, the packages called chromosomes. And in males and females, there's one set of your chromosomes. You get all your information from your mom and your dad. So for most genes in our body, we have 2 copies. One that came from mom, one that came from dad. Most of our chromosomes are paired, one from mom, one from dad. The only exception is this sex chromosome pair is one that is not identical in males and females. All of the other chromosomes, if you were to see them, and I'm not showing you a whole picture, would be different. So on the right, Is it your right? No, your left. You see an X and a Y. Anyone know what that means? I hear girl, boy. Mostly boy. You guys are right. Okay. So the Y chromosome actually contains very little instructions other than instructions for male development. So information about sperm production, information about other kinds of male development only. If that Y is there, male. The information on the X chromosome is the same. In girls, you have 2 copies of it. No instructions for male development, you're a girl. You have 2 copies of all of the genes. Males only have 1 copy. Well, like a bicycle, does someone ride unicycles? Males have a wheel that gets them around just fine. That X chromosome works, has all the instructions you need. Women are lucky. We got 2 of them. We can get around on a bicycle. However, when we're talking about a dominant change in the gene, if that gene is knocked out, so on either X chromosome, if you're a male, you don't have a second copy. The wheel goes flat, you're done. It's not working. However, interestingly, for women, well, we've got the second X. What happened to that? How come it doesn't help us? It turns out that a dominant change, even one change, it's like that bicycle. If you flatten one tire, you're still not going anywhere, even though that back tire is still working. So a dominant change simply means that one knockout, one gene not working, stops the whole process. Now you've heard that women can have a little bit more variation in the way they present, and that is because our body actually shuts down one of our X chromosomes. So in all of the cells in our body, we turn one off because we don't need both of those instructions. And by random chance, every once in a while, you might get lucky and have the one that's not working get turned off in most of your cells. It doesn't usually happen that way, but it can. So let's go back to the inheritance. You've seen a slide like this earlier. When the mom has XLH, we'll start there because that's the easy one. She has 2 X chromosomes. One of them has the FEX gene that's not working. One has a working copy of the FEX gene. She will pass on only 1 copy. We don't get to share everything with our kids, much as we would like to sometimes. We're only going to give half of our genetic information. So mom gives 1 X chromosome. By random chance, she will either give the one that's working or the one that's not. There's no way to predict it, and there's no way to affect it. So it's just going to happen. So for each of her kids, there's a 50-50 chance. And it doesn't matter whether they're male or female. Her X chromosome is going to be given to her sons. Her X chromosome is going to go to her daughters. So it doesn't matter either way. That 50-50 chance doesn't mean that it's exactly 50-50. So if you have 4 kids, it doesn't mean 2 of them will have it and 2 of them won't. It means each time you're flipping a coin. If I sat here and flipped a coin, there's going to be runs of heads, there's going to be runs of tails, and we see that in any 50-50 condition. Just because it happened before doesn't mean it happens again. Or just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it will happen. What's different in an X-linked condition is what happens with men who have this condition. Because they are going to pass on to their sons their Y chromosome, they will never, ever be able to pass on the X chromosome that has the mutation. So all of the sons of a man who has this condition will be unaffected, all of them. What does that mean for their daughters? All of them will be affected. So all of their daughters if you're getting your X chromosome from your dad and he has this condition, your X chromosome carries that mutation. So this is one of the hardest concepts for medical students to get. They want to say, oh, no, it's 50-50, right? All of the daughters inherited their father's X chromosome. Now, I have to qualify, unless it's not your father, you got his X chromosome. So the other question that comes up, so does everyone with this condition have the same medical problems? You guys in this room can answer this question probably quicker than I can. And the answer is no. This is hugely, hugely variable. There is not one given set picture. There are certain common things. You know what the medical issues can be, but we don't always know what they're going to be. And we don't even know that when we're looking at someone who has the same, so even if you have the exact same genetic variation as the person sitting next to you with this condition, does not mean you will have the same clinical picture. Even if it's in the same family. Well, this is the way my dad was, this is the way I'm going to be, right? No. So someone asked this question earlier, and this is a really important concept to be aware of. A mildly affected parent can have a child with more severe medical issues than they've had. The reverse is also true. A parent with very severe medical issues can have a child with a very mild clinical picture. It is not the gene itself, oops, I think that's the next one, the type of genetic mutation in the FEX gene does not predict what medical issues are going to happen. So we can tell you have this condition, we can't tell you exactly what it's going to look like medically. We also, although we've talked about, well, women, can they have more variation? Yeah, there's some evidence of that, but ultimately, I can't predict by gender alone how severe or mild the medical condition is going to be. That's what dominant means. When that gene is not working, it causes clinical symptoms. Have to mention these other hereditary hypophosphatemias because they clinically, when you make that clinical diagnosis, remember where I started with that? They look very similar. In fact, sometimes we can't, from the biochemical, the lab tests, can't tell the difference. But they have different inheritance patterns. So there is an autosomal dominant, which works kind of like it is for the women. 2 copies of the gene, you pass down one that's working, good. Pass down one that isn't working, you got the condition. Autosomal recessive is a little different. This is one where both parents carry a silent gene that's not working. But they're fine because this is a little different. It's only when the child inherits both copies that aren't working where you can have that condition. And on here, there are specific genes that are different than the FEX gene that cause these kind of conditions, these 2 conditions. But from a genetic standpoint, these are the other 2 conditions we have to think about because inheritance is different. And if you had one of these types of hypophosphatemia, we would be talking about a different way of looking at your risks for kids. So, big question. Do you need genetic testing? Anyone? Yes? No? I like it. Good question. So, you don't need it for treatment. Clinical diagnosis treatment is based on what's going on clinically. It's not going to predict the medical issues if you have. So you've got the gene, you don't have the gene. I can't predict the medical issues. But you're right. If you're reproductive planning, having genetic testing lets me do a few things. It lets me first verify, yes, this is the X-linked form, and that tells me how the inheritance is going to be. It also allows prenatal testing. If I know what gene is, what's different about your FEX gene, I can then test the baby, or we also have the ability to test before that baby is born, so pre-implantation, so an embryo we can actually test. So I can look at this. But that raises a whole lot of questions. What do we do with that information? And doing prenatal testing is very, very important to think about. Is it helpful for me to know this information? But it's also important to have genetic testing if you want to do early diagnosis. So early on, the phosphate levels may not be different. In a baby, we may not know immediately. So having that early diagnosis, we can do a genetic test when a baby's born. We can do it at 6 months. The genes don't change, but the clinical picture does. So and we can wait to see clinical symptoms, or we can test the genes and know this child is not affected. We don't need to do anything differently. Or this child does have that mutation. We need to follow them more carefully, or monitor them, or maybe start early treatment. And this is where it gets out of my specialty. I don't know when treatment can be started, but certainly something important to know is it helpful to have this early information? So probably the biggest question that comes to me as a genetic counselor is, what do I do if I want children? Well, talk to someone like me. My job is to go over the genetics, to talk about what your options are, to talk about what kind of testing is available, what will it tell you if we do this testing. Another thing to think about is if you are a woman with this condition, you might want to see someone who does high-risk pregnancy specialties, a perinatologist, just to make sure that there isn't anything that medically they'll need to monitor you differently for, or that you want to be watched carefully for certain kinds of medical issues. I actually was trying to do a search for pregnancy-related problems in this condition. There isn't a lot out there. So it's one of the problems that we still don't quite understand is how do we manage your pregnancy if you're a woman going through this? The answer is we may not know all the answers, But having someone thinking about your condition while you're pregnant is a very important thing to have. So finally, let's see where I'm early. We'll have plenty of time for questions. So finally, thinking about what do I tell others? This is another place where a lot of times as a genetic counselor, I'm supporting families and saying, how do you let your kids know? How do you let other family members know? How do you deal with those questions at the grocery store? Those are really important things to be dealing with, and it's one of the big issues when you have anything that physically changes your appearance where someone can say, what's different about you? We all have some of those things, but some of them, I don't know what it is about people where they feel they have the right to ask you questions on the street, but they do. And you guys probably can say this better than I can. You know those questions get here, so what do you say? You are not obligated to answer any of those questions. First of all, let me give you permission to say, it's none of your business. It's okay to say that. But if you're gonna say something, sometimes keeping it simple is probably the easiest way to deal with it. I have a bone condition that causes weak bones. Or if someone says, well, isn't there treatment? Treatment is out there, but we still need a cure. So finding those, now these are phrases that you can use or not. You may have your own phrase. I know sometimes families will come up with their simple phrase that is the quick response to a question they don't want to answer. So if you don't have one, talk to someone else in this room because I'll bet there are a few answers out there for how you respond to people. But having those in hand is really important. The other part is if this is a diagnosis in the family, family members can have a mild form of this. It's not unusual for a parent to be diagnosed only after their child was diagnosed. So having this in the family, thinking about that genetic testing is, are there other people in the family that need to know about this? The answer is usually yes. We need to make sure if they're getting the right treatment, if there's a chance their child could have this condition, and we need to pay attention to that. Also talking to your children, which I don't have up here, is another place. If you're a parent with this and you've got a child who's born with a condition, when do you start talking about it? What do you say? There is no easy answer to this, except that it should be one of the clear answers in any genetic condition is that it should be part of general conversation to the level of the kids. That you really want to start when they're young, that this is just part of who, doesn't define them. This is not who they are. This is part of how their body works, and nothing more, nothing less. So it's an important piece to keep it in mind that this is to not minimize the impact. I mean, you heard this, I've heard the stories here that this really impacts life, but also to recognize that the whole person is a bigger person than that one genetic change. So on that note, I will let you guys ask questions because I know there were a lot of questions that came up. Yes?
What is it that turns it? I'm a carrier. My father obviously gave it to me. He had no symptoms. And there was a job in high school. What is it that turns it on?
It's always turned on. It's how much it's affecting. And we don't even know what it's doing. Go back to, we don't know what the FEX gene does. We know that something downstream, whatever it does, can sometimes cause that buildup of the FGF23, but we don't know what it does. So the answer is we do see people who have almost no symptoms. Maybe if we test their blood, we can see it in their blood, but we may not see any physical symptoms. But from a genetic standpoint, if you have the gene, you have some mild form of the condition. Does that answer the question? But we don't know why. That's really, the answer is that still needs to be understood. And it's, you will have to take my word for it. From a genetic standpoint, you have we know there are conditions that have variable expression. So, correct. And technically, something different is working with that particular gene, but it's not working so differently or enough that we see symptoms in you. Question? I'll wait for the mic.
In North Carolina, there are 6 genetic counselors, and it's months to get an appointment.
Yeah.
So it's easy for people to do I'm sorry, Kim. It's easy to say, oh, you should go to a genetic counselor. You should be referred. It's expensive. Insurance doesn't cover it very easily, and then you can't get an appointment. In my family, it was hereditary, so we knew my father, myself, my 2 sisters, both my children, and a grandchild has XLH. But for the people who are spontaneous, what was the other word you used?
Sporadic.
Sporadic. They feel very lonely and isolated. Now, this is the point of the XLH
Right.
days. But if you are looking for prenatal counseling, what do you recommend? How do you get there?
So there are places that will offer phone counseling. At Kaiser, we're member-based. So you're a Kaiser member, you get your services, and genetic services are offered to all of our Kaiser members. So it's a little different within a health maintenance organization like I work in. Privately, there are organizations that will offer phone counseling. There are organizations that will offer individual, but you're right, there is limited genetic counseling services. We have, I think, now 3,000 genetic counselors in the United States. And so there still are not enough counselors to meet the needs of the people who need support in that kind of way. Yeah.
Will you help us put information on our website about
Where I can, what I can do, there's, the National Society of Genetic Counselors actually has a listing of all genetic counselors that are available in the country. So you can get a link to that, and that's the best way to find. We have on that site, we actually have a page called Find a Genetic Counselor. So if you're looking for a genetic counselor, that's how you can find someone. And I get referrals periodically. Someone will email me, and I say, I work for Kaiser, so unless you're a Kaiser member, I can't provide services, but here's how you reach that next person. Other questions? It's, if you Google NSGC, National Society of Genetic Counselors, it's on their homepage. Yeah.
When you're getting genetic testing done and they build a probe, that probe is meant to identify a mutation in the FX gene,
Correct.
right? And are those probes designed to identify any of those 285 variants?
No, so that's an important question. If you have a FX mutation in your family, that mutation is, unfortunately, sporadic. It just happens randomly that change takes place. But once that change is there, the body's really good about copying it exactly the way it is. So for the future generations, once that mutation is there in that family, it's always the same mutation in that family. And that's why doing the genetic testing allows us to look for it, because we know what we're looking for. We're only looking for this change in this family. But it's also why we can't just randomly say, well, let's look for everything, because those other changes don't apply to your family.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. There's a question back there.
So does that mean if you have a child and you get their blood levels tested, but not test for the gene, and
So
they test negative,
and
they
this is
might-
where I actually have to refer. I don't know the answer to when you will always see that low phosphate level in the blood, but the answer is, from what I understand, is that in infancy, phosphate levels are higher to begin with, and you may not have levels low enough to call it XLH. So even though we know there's a risk for that child to be affected, we may not automatically know that child has the condition if the mom is the one carrying the gene.
Okay.
Because remember, if the dad is the one carrying the gene, do we know the answer?
Right, the girls will have it. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
For really young infants, it can be hard to make the diagnosis. So before the age of 6 to 9 months, sometimes even as old as a year, the diagnosis could be missed because the blood levels may not be as low, may not be low enough for a firm diagnosis. If they have the mutation, generally they would become symptomatic after about a year. So there may be no symptoms, and the blood levels may not actually show too much of an abnormality in the first year. Sometimes you can make the diagnosis early, but sometimes you can't. Right. Clinically, we make the diagnosis just with routine clinical testing. Yes. No. Right. It's a special test.
I was just going to say that if you find that your child has been tested biochemically blood and the urine testing, and it comes back negative at a young age, and you find that maybe they have symptoms and you're concerned, please don't hesitate to have them tested again, because we sometimes have patients who don't show. We generally at Yale start testing around 2 to 3 months of age, especially if we know that there's a family history. But if at that time we don't see the biochemical diagnosis, we do still follow the child over a period of time and test again. So that's just something that I think is very important, so we don't miss any diagnoses, especially when there's a family history.
Can I ask a question? Are you one of the researchers? Because one of the questions we often get from families is, can't we have the genetic testing just to confirm that mutation is there or not? Is that being considered at some point? Because this is what we would offer is, we could do family testing to identify the mutation in one of the parents, test the child, and we have an immediate answer.
Well, it's expensive.
Yeah,
and so unfortunately it's not, I don't believe it's covered by all insurance companies, if any.
Well, it's covered by some, certainly.
So it is covered by some? Okay. So I think that's one of the concerns, and also there are definitely some cases where we can easily make a diagnosis from the blood and urine.
Right.
Do you agree?
I would say that the lab testing is usually much less expensive than genetic testing. That I recognize.
And just to add to that, if the father's affected, the daughter will have the disease.
Right.
So even if the blood tests don't show it at an early age, we know that the daughter will have the disease, and so the blood testing should be repeated when the child's a little bit older. Right. Sure.
Are there more questions?
Yeah.
I actually did in vitro with I have twins, and just for genetic purposes. And my pediatrician I keep asking, like, should I still get them tested? They aren't showing any symptoms, but so the doctors keep telling me, no, don't worry about getting any XLH testing done. Should I push for it? No, just with my twins, should I just see if they have it? My doctors are telling me, don't worry about it, they aren't showing symptoms, but because I have it and...
So I can answer that,
it's not,
sort of.
Okay.
Pre-implantation diagnosis takes an embryo, we take a single cell, and we look in that single cell to check in this case, the XLH gene. And it almost always is accurate, but there is that small potential that it's not. Without symptoms, the risk is low enough that you probably don't need to be doing regular testing on your children.
Okay. Yeah, because
so
they told me
that's the easy answer is yes, there are, and we hear about those misses every once in a while, but they're pretty rare.
Okay, so I shouldn't push the pediatricians.
You probably don't need
Okay.
to. Okay. Question over here?
More of a statement, having had a daughter. My daughter at 3 months old did not have elevated anything levels. At 6 months old, she did. And I kept pushing the pediatrician to make sure they tested her, because there is the 50-50 chance that they had it. And being the person who was the knowledge source at that point, because the pediatrician does not know much about XLH, I had to keep telling him, no, really, there's a 50-50 chance, and I had to stay on him to make sure that the tests were done regularly, because he said, oh, well, we did it once, that's it. No, the phosphate levels change. So you are your child's best advocate for the parents, and if you're having kids, make sure they're tested early on, about 2 or 3 months, and again at 6 months, just to be safe. The urine tests and the blood tests are not very expensive. Most insurances will cover those with no problem. What I would like to see, though, as parents here, is that we advocate that they make the genetic testing more standard and more accessible, because if we knew right away, we would be prepared and be able to start treatment as soon as anything showed up. And the earlier treatment started when it's needed, the better. I mean, you want your children to have healthy bones and healthy cartilage, and the longer you wait to get that diagnosed, the more damage is done in their growing years. So we don't have a choice right now. I feel very constrained by what the insurance companies will and will not consider reasonable. I understand genetic testing is more expensive, but for XLH, we have a 50-50 chance for our kids having it.
And this majorly affects our lives and will majorly affect their lives. And I think the insurance companies need to know this. And they need to know if we don't get it taken care of now, it's going to be a worse problem later down the road for them. Because the insurance companies help pay the bills too, and they're not going to want it financially.